Hey everyone, welcome to the SIG-AUTH call. Today is May 21, 2025. This call is recorded and will be published to YouTube, follows the CNCF Code of Conduct. So we have a packed agenda. First, maybe we want to finish the announcements. Uh, uh, Kubernetes emulation version update.
Hi everyone. This is Siwan, and so as we start the cycle of 1.34, I'd like to draw your attention to this announcement we made last month regarding some Kubernetes development change related to emulation version. So a little bit of the background. The emulation version is a feature we introduced in SIG-AUTH in 131 for safe upgrade. So it adds a new flag called emulated version, which can make it possible to emulate the features and APIs from an earlier version up to 3 versions before the current version. So in order to make this work, we have to preserve the history of feature changes and then also uh, keep the code in the code base for 3 extra releases. So if you're reviewing any feature changes, if you're graduating any feature in this release, please spend some time to read this doc. And so the main change we have introduced is first how we track the feature changes. So we have added this versioned list of feature lifecycle. So it's an append-only list. So if you're graduating a feature from one stage to another, it needs to be tracked in this style. And then for feature removal, if you're graduating a feature, deprecating a feature, because we need to emulate the Kubernetes servers like 3 versions backward. So we need to still keep the feature code in the code base and also have the enablement or disablement test still working. So there are some instructions of how you can set the feature flag, feature gate, even if it has been locked to default. And then in for other feature behavior changes, if you're changing a beta feature or a GA feature like in any impactful way, we suggest you add a new feature flag, a lightweight feature gate to just to preserve the history of how this feature should work. And then for API changes, the main thing is about API removal. If you're removing an API in a release, you should still have the testing for the removed API for 3 extra releases. So I think that's all the changes we're introducing. And if you have any questions, please contact us for any issues or suggestions. Any questions? Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the next thing on the announcement is the milestones, the 134 milestone. So enhancements freeze is Friday, June 20th. So we need to get the KEPs open, updated, and then reviewed. And for beta and GA KEPs, also like this PRR. So um, need to plan the time accordingly for that. And code freeze is July 24th, 2025.
Just to chime in on that, in case you hadn't seen the announcements, the bar for beta or on by default features is higher than it has been in the past. So as you are looking to graduate things that are currently alpha to beta, you may get asked to pull some of the things that were in your GA graduation criteria into your beta phase. Things like finish testing and fix any known issues. things that are entirely reasonable to address as part of becoming on by default or being beta level. But just prepare for that if this was an existing feature that you're just looking to bump to beta.
You mean beta is the new GA and GA is just GA that you can't turn off?
On by default is the new stable. Yeah. On by default is we think it's stable enough to turn it on by default.
In your production cluster.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. I don't disagree.
Yeah. SIG-AUTH has been very good about it anyway.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so now on to the discussion topics. Mo, you have the first one.
Okay, so yeah, this was pulled in from, I think, one of their triage meetings when we were looking at this issue. I just wasn't really sure how we decide what goes in this list, because I think this list was originally written by the folks that were in like working group multi-tenancy. I have absolutely no idea what they did to validate or vet any of these projects. And I don't know how to validate or vet any new additions or removals or changes to this list. Yeah, that's the gist of it. So I don't know how to progress. I don't want to just leave this person's PR open either.
So there's actually like guidance on the website, like for the whole Kubernetes website about links to non-Kubernetes projects. In general, the guidance is we don't link from the website to non-Kubernetes projects unless you're required to run an instance of a thing for your cluster to be functional. So examples are container runtime. Like if you don't have a container runtime, your cluster will not work. And so it feels a little silly not to give pointers to like, here are the container runtimes that you could use. Similar for CNI. So CNI, CRI, things like that. This is not something like that. So the current state of this page is a little bit inconsistent. There's existing things there. I would probably be inclined to drop all the links from the page rather than try to vet and like be a kingmaker between projects. There's the ones that are there. It's like a weird mix of commercial, not even open source things that from what I could tell. And then there are others that are open source. That's just super weird. I would probably drop these links. That's my take. Anyone else have thoughts?
So I don't disagree with you, Jordan. I didn't read the page in its entirety. I don't know how much you read of it. Do you think that page would still remain useful without the links? If I think that would be my only concern is that, like, if somehow without the links the page like doesn't have like meaning anymore.
So some of them were like approaches to like treating namespaces consistently across clusters, putting policy around labels. Like I think those concepts are still useful concepts, even if we don't like recommend particular third-party projects to do those things.
Okay.
I think Kamaji and vCluster are linked at the bottom. It just doesn't show up in the diff. So there's like other projects that are kind of in the context of the entire page as well that are listed that would probably be removed.
Okay.
We can, there may be more nuance there, like if it's a CNCF project or if it's an open source project, but even then you get into like vetting issues. Like it's just very strange to point people at projects and then they go apply like a manifest to their cluster. And I don't know how to take responsibility for that.
Okay. So I think I agree with you, Jordan, on trying to edit this page to remove the links. If no one else disagrees with that approach, then I guess we could maybe, Jordan, sorry, David, your hand's up.
I do. I want to see, Jordan, if, so for links to external projects, non-Kubernetes, non-Kubernetes SIGs projects. I definitely agree. It's a very easy rule to have. Would you eliminate links to Kubernetes SIGs projects, or would you leave those? And it's actually a concrete thing on this file. I can just see one line. 513, I've never used Cappy nested, but it is linked, Kubernetes SIGs.
By default, I would be inclined to leave those links. If there are, if the docs are not clear about the state of those projects, then we should clarify those. If the projects are dead or archived, we should remove those links. But if it's an active project and we're clear about the state of it, I think it's fine to leave that. It being in the project means we have more recourse if there's issues with it. You know, if there's security issues or if there's maintenance issues or it needs to be archived, like it's in scope for the project.
Okay. And you're confident that other SIGs see their Kubernetes SIGs projects as things that they will take care of for bits like CVE maintenance and just
unfortunately today, from the SRC perspective, everything in Kubernetes scope as Kubernetes SIGs is in scope of SRC and bounties and everything. There is plans to make it more opt-in and get agreement from SIGs that they will actually support their projects in useful and meaningful ways if there are CVEs. But I think, yeah, currently, David, the stance of the project is if you're in Kubernetes SIGs, you're like a tier 2, we'll pay you this much money if there's CVEs.
I believe you, but I do recall a conversation just last week discussing how a SIG was very proud of creating a spot that they had no intention of maintaining. So
that's why I would like to move it to an opt-in model where there is an explicit agreement from the SIG for every project, such that it makes sense for us to be issuing bounties and such.
One way to view that is in the docs, you're very clear about what the level of stability is. I could see that. Just want to make sure that we see the same thing and don't have misguided notions about how these are actually handled. So, okay.
Okay. The next one is Rita.
Yeah, I think there's some discussions around what the best next step is. I think there's different opinions here. I don't actually know if anybody from that issue is on the call.
I spent some time digging in. I can summarize if people want the 20-second version. The way various layers deal with capabilities in the pod spec is really inconsistent. Sometimes they expect a cap underscore prefix, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they expect case sensitivity, sometimes they don't. There is a very specific API level validation that rejects a pod trying to set cap sysadmin uppercase with the cap underscore prefix in combination with allow new privileges false, and doesn't prevent any of these other like incantations that would actually get them privilege escalation. That's the current state. And so there's two ways we could go. One is to remove that validation and say, you know what, do whatever you want. We weren't effectively preventing attacks, so do whatever you want. The other way is to try to make it more visible when you're doing things that are confused, like saying no new privileges and granting capabilities that would let a pod get new privileges. So those are the two directions we can go. I think saying no new privileges and then granting capabilities that allow adding privileges is very confused, and I would like to warn more. I don't know if I would reject pods, but at least warn the person like what you're doing doesn't make sense, rather than trying to relax and remove validation, even if the current validation isn't like protecting against an attacker with pod write access. Mo has a hand. Is that still?
So question, Jordan, do you see any of this funneling into like changes to pod security admission for later versions to have stricter validation for like the restricted or baseline profiles?
I think pod security admission already prevents these things.
Oh, okay.
So like if you're using baseline or restricted pod security admission, from what I could tell, the capabilities it was saying were issues, like those already are excluded by baseline and restricted
Okay.
profiles.
Okay. So then this is primarily about when you're not running pod security admission, what is the default behavior?
Yeah.
So we could certainly warn, but I don't see a path for how we would do more than warning without some kind of opt-in, right?
Yeah, pod security admission is a much more holistic and comprehensive approach. I think that's where we would point people. This validation is very old and very niche, and I don't see us expanding this particular validation. I think that's too breaking. I think we would just point people to pod security admission. But I also don't really see the value of removing this and saying, you know what, actually it's fine. Like this one little toehold of sanity where like you can't combine this thing that says you want to restrict permissions with this other thing that says you want to expand permissions. Like that's kind of crazy. Let's keep people not doing that. Vinay had a question in the chat. I don't know enough about capabilities and how all the layers handle them to know the answer to that. So I'm happy to be corrected if my understanding of the current state is not correct in some way, but I don't know.
But what's the I guess like how do we move that issue forward?
If we can get like someone on the node side who understands how these things actually work all the way through the layers to like confirm or deny my last comment, like is this the current state? I would be in favor of like adding warnings for detecting other weird uses of capabilities with this thing, and probably leave it at that. So maybe Vinay, can you take a look at that or comment on the issue?
Sure. Yeah, I can take a pass. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Next one is Nabarun.
Hey everyone. So I have a quick question. Like, is it possible to have like authentication mechanisms on conversion webhooks? Right now, we don't have any way to specify modes like MTLS or like how validation and mutation takes a kubeconfig file and generates the client. I understand it might not be that simple as it is described in the issue to solve it. And certainly how it is proposed in the issue is not the correct way because conversion is not a admission plugin. There needs to be some other place where this needs to go. So thought of like coming and asking like, what do people think about it? If there are some ways to do it right now in some other way, or like, is it acceptable for a proposal to be explored in this area?
I think David has a hand.
Yeah, so so part of the reason why we allow and have a mechanism for authenticating a client to an admission webhook is that the admission webhook can have access to or take action based on some external system or some other information in a namespace, or the fact that a namespace exists that may not be available to everyone. So you don't want to let just anyone who has network access make a request to it, because you could leak information about who the users are or what namespaces exist. For a conversion webhook, I wouldn't expect that to happen, because every user should get the same output for the input being selected, and it should be based purely on the input being passed, not based on the state of some other system. What is the need to be authenticated to a conversion webhook?
I would expect if the 3 dimensions are like availability, integrity, and confidentiality, it's only availability, right? Like it's just a DOS vector. Because you're right, conversion is stateless, so you only get out what you put in. So integrity and confidentiality aren't risks for conversion webhooks.
To some extent they are. Like, what if I wanted to have my conversion webhook be hosted in a centralized way for many clusters?
Conversion is stateless. It can't depend on anything except what is passed in. So availability is a risk, but integrity and
knowing whether you have some resource registered or supported for a given cluster, that's in some sense, confidentiality. Maybe not important confidentiality.
Okay.
If you wanted to do something like rate limiting based on the client and know which cluster is being rate limited to a central cloud conversion or something. I mean, I'm stretching here.
Yeah. I think the main one is like availability, like DOS or performance. I'm not opposed in principle to conversion authentication. It's not. I don't see it as a huge priority. And actually, conversion is like the client used for conversion is probably more on the API machinery side than. I mean, I guess we're a little bit involved. But like CRDs and conversion webhooks, like that's the plumbing for that is API machinery. So we'd be happy to consult on like how to wire a client, but everybody there knows how to wire a cert into a client.
The code certainly is in API extension and API server, so that is for sure API machinery. I just wanted like, in principle, like what do people think about the idea? Because what is happening right now is if you have one controller manager which is exposing webhooks for all 3 functions, you currently can't communicate with that webhook for all those 3 things on the same port, right? Because it's exactly the error which is coming out.
You can say request a client certificate, and then in the handlers for the webhook ones, you can require it and not for the others. So you can request, but not require, and then verify that it's there in your handlers for the webhook endpoints.
Isn't it plumbed into controller manager? But again, like I completely understand. Even the question that I'm asking right now is not in the scope of this meeting. So I'm happy to take it async as well.
I'm not philosophically opposed, but I also don't find it to be very important. And I will say you get a lot of overlap between these 2 meetings. This would not be high on my API machinery list, right? Just, again, not philosophically opposed. If somebody wanted to, if we had an approver in API machinery who wanted to push on this and push it forward, I wouldn't block it, but
yeah, some of the statements made in the description of the issue, I think, are not actually quite true. Like you could run the same server on the same port and just request the certificate and then only require it for the endpoints. So narrowly, you could accomplish what they're trying to do, but you would, the issues with protection of conversion endpoints, I guess maybe confidentiality, maybe availability, that's still a gap.
I'm trying to decouple both of these things because the core issue that is pointed out here is easily solved by like just decoupling things too. But in general, like I felt like there is a gap with webhook authentications that we support. Sorry, Jordan, you were saying something. I think I spoke over you with some internet lag.
I think if we had infinite time, we wouldn't be opposed to a change here, but it's not high on the priority list.
Okay.
Okay. I think we've reached the last item. So this is something that I added based on there was a Slack thread about the same thing because the Flux folks were asking about associating a service account with a resource that's not a pod. And then there was also a GitHub issue around it, and then Jordan has been responding to that one. But I wanted to bring that up here because there are a couple of projects out there that follow the similar model. So one of the things is also like the SIG-AUTH sub project, right? The secret store sync controller that we created follows a similar model where it binds a service account to a custom resource called secret sync, and then the controller basically generates a token using that service account that's associated with that custom resource, and then uses that for workload identity purposes. Um, and based on all the comments, like one of the things that I saw was there was a PR open on the Flux RFC where they said this model won't work for EKS pod identity because it checks pod specific claims. And Mo also added a comment about how we are doing things in Azure, like where the expectation is that the service account token is actually bound to a pod or node. Like we do those kind of validations in the future, like we're planning to do it. So given cloud providers are doing that, like the model of associating the service account to a custom resource will not work in the future. So we wanted to bring that up for discussion here and see what is the best way for doing this going forward, like for instances where a controller is trying to do workload identity, but rather than associating its own service account to the identity, it wants to use like per workload identity. And I summarized one of the discussions that me, Mo, and like few others had, like in terms of how we could approach this in the secret store sync controller. If the idea is to have like multi-tenant and so basically have different namespaces and you want to sync in different namespaces, you could modify the controller to basically run in a namespace mode so that it only acts upon like custom resources within a particular namespace, which means in every namespace that you want to sync, you would have an instance of the controller like that's packaged with the provider. And then in terms of workload identity, you would assign that controller's identity in that particular namespace, like for workload identity purposes. But this does mean that the controller has to run in like every single namespace, like a particular action is required, which is syncing as Kubernetes secret.
Maybe I have a dumb question. Why can't there's one, so if you have one central controller running in the cluster, can it not use the Kubernetes API to grant itself a token for whichever KSA Kubernetes service account it needs?
So just a little bit of background on the way that Flux drops privileges. When we perform Kubernetes operations, we use the impersonate verb. We don't grab a token using token request. I don't think token request was very popular back when we did that, but we just used the impersonation mechanism. We decided not to use our own username namespace. We just used the system service accounts namespace. But one benefit of using impersonation is the service account resource doesn't even need to exist in order to role bind against it, which just like it's trade-offs on a couple of different attack surfaces. When we want to talk to the cloud, the way that this RFC is written does involve using token request to get that SA token, like you mentioned. Whether or not the cloud will give us a cloud identity for that token, and whether or not you can write authorization policies in the cloud against whatever identity comes back from that, is sort of a different story depending on if you're talking about AWS, Google, or Azure. So I I think the answer the short answer to your question is yes, you can get a token, but the nuanced answer is what the heck do you do with it, and is that going to change in the future? And I think that that's kind of the crux of the conversation. Does that kind of make sense to hear?
Yeah, I think so.
Um, I'm I wrote just like some short sentences under my section here. My username is StealthyBox. Um, Flux controllers, there are multiple, have Kubernetes identities, and then they also potentially have cloud identities. And how we switch into a context where you are using a cloud role or you're like switching privileges, if we use the token request API, then we're basically delegating authentication, like the signing of the JOT, like to the cluster service account issuer. And that verb, the token request, can be constrained. Like you can constrain Flux's behavior of what it's impersonating to reconcile a resource with Kubernetes RBAC, right? By saying, no, you're not allowed to token request to this versus this. And then the signing is the cluster issuer, and the verification of those tokens is the cloud talking to that cluster's issuer over the internet. Alternatively, we also are looking at options of integrating directly with each cloud's IAM stuff and using whatever impersonation mechanisms are there using Flux's controller cloud identities, where the Kubernetes API is not in the mix at all. And that model is totally different, on like how much you're trusting Flux versus this versus whatever. So we're really looking for advice on how to do this well and do this durably and in a way that is hopefully somewhat uniform across the cloud providers, and hopefully could extend to smaller cloud providers as well, or on-premises spiffy installations. The context is that Flux has a lot of different sorts of cloud APIs that it does need to talk to. Everything from container registries to cloud storage, to potentially like Git repos and like secrets stores for decrypting secrets as it's applying things into the cluster, to event buses for sending notifications to teams on Slack, or you know a Teams channel or something like that. So there are a number of interfaces here where when you're sharing maybe multiple clusters with multiple teams in an org, where you really want to subdivide into a lot of different accounts. Jordan, you have a hand up.
I think Mo first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to touch back on to hear your question, right? So just to be specific, right? The reason you can't just have like a meta controller that goes around and prints out service account tokens is like the newer stuff for workload identity federation that's coming in the not too distant future for like AKS will refuse to use those tokens because they won't be pod bound, and even if they are pod bound, it'll notice the request isn't coming from the right origin and doesn't have the right TPM bound, so it'll just reject it, saying no, you don't.
I mean, that kind of sounds like a problem for Azure customers trying to use Flux with
No,
AKS. I mean, like we could introduce the same things on Google, but I think it's up to the cloud provider to decide what they.
Sure.
Yeah, so
like Kubernetes supports just a non-bound service account token, right? Still, so
sure,
that's a valid thing.
But that's not really the point here, right? The point is that they want to use the service account token in the context of workload identity outside of Kube, right? So the mechanism needs to make some kind of sense in a way that actually works with the existing integrations, right? So, or future integrations. So like it already won't work in EKS's latest and greatest pod identity, and it won't work in Azure's. So now you're missing two of the three major cloud providers. So probably going down the wrong route.
Just like, I mean, it sounds like Flux already does adapting to cloud APIs. So it says, we want to do this generic thing, and the implementation for this particular cloud does this, and this other cloud does that. Like, it sounds like the thing you want is, I want an isolated identity presumably based on something Kubernetes like a service account, making use of cloud-specific token exchanges sounds like the right approach. And if a particular cloud doesn't offer a way to exchange a token the way you want, then that means that capability isn't available on that cloud. Rather than trying to make Cube like a generic exchange service account for cloud identity without going through, actually running a pod on an actual node the way the cloud is expecting you to do it in their workload identity integration. So it sounds like what you want is a generic thing that has specific implementations on each cloud, but maybe those clouds aren't providing that today or don't intend to in the future. It just sounds like a mismatch between how you're trying to use it and what the clouds intend to provide with their workload identities. I mean, raising it here so that, a lot of the folks who work on those workload identity integrations are here. So it's helpful to know if people are making use of it in unexpected ways or creative ways, so that if it could be accommodated, that it's helpful to know, but I think it's a question for the cloud folks.
Yes, we're totally open to having like targeted one-on-one conversations with the clouds. It does sort of cross-cut like how the APIs and the capabilities and constraints that are provided by Kubernetes end up sort of being used in the ecosystem and then by the vendors and infrastructure providers. So I do think that there's a need for some guidance or at least some like group collaboration in like how we figure out what to say is like really a good behavior to support. Like we don't want to do this wrong, you know. And we took a lot of care previously when we, did multi-tenants for the Kubernetes API within Flux to not do it wrong. And when default service account tokens were deprecated, it didn't affect, Flux. And we don't want to build something that becomes load bearing for potentially people with very large infrastructure that, like makes it difficult for folks to migrate to more secure workload identity. I will say, I think Mo, I think in the EKS case, we have not validated this yet, but I think the role binding or the trust policy object that allows you to tie a role to a pod identity has like a specific expression, and like using that, like those verbs and like that declaration does not work with the token exchange in an EKS pod identity cluster. But what we have not validated is that it may be possible to use regular AWS IAM features that are not pod identity specific to bind against the identity that comes back from that token exchange, even in the new cluster. And
I
I don't know.
validated that.
Were you able to, Matthias?
Yeah. Can you please repeat what you said to confirm that what I validated was exactly that?
In an EKS pod identity cluster with the newest version of their workload identity, that if you token exchange a Kubernetes SIG-AUTH for a AWS STS token, that you can still write a regular IAM role binding that's not pod identity specific.
Yes, that's what we already have working, and I've tested that many times.
Okay.
That's currently possible in all the clouds.
Yeah, because it's not really well. Yeah. Anyway, it's when using the Kubernetes JOTs, it's basically like do the cloud providers like give us a way to validate and trade an identity for some web web identity that comes from Kubernetes. And there are some other features. Oh, Mateus, you're raising your hand. Keep talking.
Sorry. So what I think it's like sensible to ask is that Kubernetes has already a issuer, right? An identity provider, which right now it's like built around service accounts, right? You have like you ask for a token, the private key that is somewhere in the control plane is used to issue a token for you, and like that's what you use to get access in cloud providers. And we just want to build something in Flux that will be able to continue leveraging that. Like we want to give least privilege principle to our users while not building spiffy and Spire into Flux, right? Like why would I ask, like why would it make sense to ask for users to create a private key or configure KMS or something like that? If the cluster is already able to provide identities. So we're just asking for a way to continue leveraging that, which I don't know, in my head, it makes so much sense, right?
I think you have the actors confused. Kubernetes does not get to assert to the cloud providers what they are willing to exchange, right? So just because Kubernetes has an API that allows you to have a token of a certain shape does not mean I will accept it, right? I being any external party, right? We are happy
it would
that
be
it's a
nice.
simple API that people can do whatever they want with, but there's no way to force someone else to consume Kubernetes service account tokens in the way that works for Flux or anyone else, right?
Right.
Yeah.
How would you implement
I want
this?
to comment on some of the little questions, right? Like, I don't want to make a new API because that doesn't solve anything because no one's going to trust the new API if they don't trust the old API. So that's not going to help. I don't want to change the existing API to add more stuff to it because I want it to be exactly the same in all the places. So if we want to add like new fancy bindings that are exactly the same, like we added for Node for everyone, that's totally cool. I'm not giving the cloud providers I have a custom API I shove into my JOTs, and now my JOTs are proprietary to my clouds and things don't work consistently. Absolutely not. In the same way we rejected that for when we added external signing, right? But you can't make someone else take Kubernetes product like Kubernetes output and say they're okay with it. Like it's not our place to make them do that.
Yeah, I think you can with current token requests, you can ask for a particular audience, and it's possible across the clouds right now to say, hey, we'll trade for JOTs if you provide a user.
Let's say, but like let me hold you there, Lee, right?
Yeah.
If I did not work at a cloud provider and I only worked on Cube, my request to all the cloud providers would be, I want you to directly use Kubernetes Service Account Tokens for all of your APIs. I don't want to do any STS. I just want you to use these JOTs directly because it is a pain in the butt to go through like 80 layers of dances to get different tokens from my starting token, right? But I do work at a cloud provider, and I know that's never going to fly. It's just not even a realistic conversation to even start, right? So like the fact that there is an STS at all is an abstraction layer between Kubernetes and random other people to get them to agree, right? But like in OpenShift, the registry directly supported service account tokens. I'm sure there's other products out there that just directly consumes Kubernetes service account tokens and just are happy to do that, right? But that's the choice of those products, right? We don't get to dictate to them how you interface between Kubernetes and them. We just give you some APIs, and if they want to use it, they can, right? But when you have a system called Workload Identity Federation, it is not surprising that it expects there to be a workload because
Yeah.
it's in the name.
I would be interested to know if there are ways that we can qualify the token, in say with, what you're thinking about with Azure's, workload identity, that where the policies that are binding to a particular permission, or a particular role are able to differentiate. Like when I say like this is allowed, it's like, oh, by default, this is an AKS identity, and it's only going to be allowed if it's, TPM attested, if it's like attested by the hardware of the network itself. But that you're able to write a policy that says, hey, like I accept, tokens with this audience that are impersonated by Flux. Because at the end of the day, like what we are trying to give people in the controller and with the namespaced resources and the Kubernetes resource model is a way to run a workload that has an identity. And it does not have to be a pod identity, but it would be really powerful, right? If people can drop privileges and specifically say, like I'm not trying to pretend to be a pod, right? And I'd like to be able to say that like only pods are allowed to do this, like in EKS, with AWS IAM. But that it's also possible to say like tokens that came from this sort of promise with these sorts of constraints, can still get permissions specifically if that is what the user's configured on the cloud side.
My gut says that that is a conversation to have with the cloud providers, because you're not really asking anything about Kubernetes at that point. You're asking what the cloud providers are willing to accept as input.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Kubernetes could do here is when you token request, and maybe this was mentioned before as something that shouldn't be done on a JOT, but there could be like a claim put on there that includes the Kubernetes service account that asks for the token, right? If there were things like that on the JOT, you'd be able to filter for JOTs that came from Flux's controller service account inside of Kubernetes. That would be a Kubernetes behavior that does not happen right now, that maybe it's reasonable.
You just broke everybody's brains. Now we're all
No,
like,
we discussed this in the past.
okay.
I think we decided not to have an undefined giant list of nested user infos embedded into JOTs, but we've discussed the idea in the past.
Yeah. At the very least, folks who work on cloud workload identities should think about like documenting the guarantees of the SDS and token exchange endpoints to say like, this is how this works now, but this is the intended use case and what the guarantees are. Like crisp up the guarantees there to make it clear to consumers what they should build or should not build and what they can depend on and what not depend on. That's probably a good AI for like everybody who publishes an API to clarify the long-term expectations.
We only have like 7 minutes. I did want to have a very targeted discussion on the secret sync controller. In particular, the comment that Nish wrote here, right? So obviously I have deep interest in the secret sync controller, and I wanted to work on Azure. So the general intention we have there is of turning the controller into a single namespace only controller, and then having the controller's identity be directly used for all workload identity federation. And it will then obviously be correctly pod bound and blah. Does anyone have any concerns about any of that?
It's possible for
actually run.
David, could you say your
Sounds hellacious to actually run, right? Like, so the idea is there's going to be a resident pod in every namespace that wants this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I wouldn't look at that and say that like that would improve my life for keeping my cluster up to date or easy to upgrade or downgrade or manage, it wouldn't be high on my list. Just as like a, do I want to use something like that? Do I agree that it could work? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, we don't necessarily want you to use it all the time, right? We want you to use the driver where you can. It's only if you need a Kubernetes secret and you have no other choice. Like, I don't necessarily want to encourage people to use it in like all their namespaces. It's not really the intention. But yeah, so
should we just not publish like secret sync functionality as part of the Kubernetes like project?
Unfortunately, the driver has it, so our choice is to just remove it from the driver and say sorry, or give people some off ramp or something.
I'm not sure this is better than saying remove
Yeah,
it.
it's a bad idea to use this.
I never said I wanted people to sync.
Sure.
It's just they insisted. And to be fair, some things like ingress controllers and similar things just make it intractable, right? Because they only take the Kubernetes secret as an input.
Yeah, I mean, Flux can also take a bunch of secrets, as inputs, to authenticate to a cloud in a multi-tenant way. But like then you have all of these secrets just sitting around.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
these aren't about like these are like random secrets from your key vaults or whatever, right? That you're using for some reason in your apps, right? And for whatever reason, you can't use the secret CSI driver and just use a volume mount, which is what we want you to do. Right. So it's a narrower use case. It's not the recommended path. It's the fine you insist path. But so David, on your specific thing, if we automated the whole egregious part that you just said about maintaining the little controllers, does that alleviate your concerns? Because that could also be done in the future.
I mean, not really. People are going to be unhappy about that then. You're going to have difficulty controlling it. At some point, they'll be like, oh, the CRD changed and I can no longer manage whatever. Is what I've seen in practice from things that try to manage per namespace. None of this, again, none of this says you can't do it. This is just based on my observation of other projects I've seen try to say install in this namespace to manage these namespaces and install in that namespace to manage those other namespaces. And now we coordinate on certain cluster scoped entities. It is hellacious to manage both for the projects and for the admins. But if your goal is to actually discourage usage, that might work.
It seems like if you have a namespace scoped thing, you should not involve a CRD, right? You should just annotate secrets that you want to be synced or have them deploy their own manifest of the namespace scope thing.
And apologies,
set
maybe
the
that's the way
flags.
that works. I was just looking at in general challenges I've seen.
Yeah, so we don't have to use a custom resource if it's a namespace scope thing. We can just pass in configuration. That's fine. So then it would just be like lifecycle stuff, like when do I update the images of these things, basically, right? It's otherwise just using a V1 core Kubernetes secrets API and some stuff.
Well, almost, because often when you do that, you'll have an annotation on an object, and you have to agree on the different annotations that are valid and in usage.
I think we could probably avoid the annotation by shoving it all into the configuration of the controller.
Okay.
Okay. But I think we can fix those and make it such that the active managing many of these things is not painful in that specific way.
I think that makes more sense than a cluster-wide thing that is trying to sync things from lots of different namespaces with wide-ranging permissions. Like if you have one legacy thing in your namespace, then it needs a secret, you deploy this like utility job. We have an example manifest, and then you set the command line flags. Oh, sync secret XYZ from Vault into secret named foo in my namespace. And you just pass a list of flags to say which secrets should be managed.
It's possible for Flux to be deployed in a model where our controllers actually shard um, a, via labels on resources, and you can use, label and admission to make sure that when a resource lands into a namespace, that it then gets picked up by a controller with a particular workload identity. So that you would have n Flux controllers for n tenants, and then you have to manage that infra, like David was saying, when you are managing also your access and your tenants. It's a pain, and it's possible to deploy Flux that way already with 0 changes. In practicality, people use many thousands of resources even in a normal Flux installation across a couple of clusters, and it's for many different many different cloud services. And as soon as you want to use like an identity to talk to this OCI repository with this KMS with this thing, then now you have to multiply like your tenant identities to get it to function. So I don't know if the recommendation to run a pod per namespace or try to create shards like per tenant that then get picked up, from resources reconciling in another namespace by some workload identity, like is really like the most ergonomic thing for end users. And again, I don't think it would encourage usage.
I think I'm specifically thinking about what I know about the secret syncing functionality. I don't know enough about what Flux does to say that that's a good idea. I'm only talking about the secret syncer.
Not to say that it's not a good solution for the secrets sync operator, but I'm just commenting that that approach may not serve the needs of the average or even Flux user at high scale.
Okay, I
Yeah,
think
Flux are not.
we're at time, and then I think there's still like things to discuss on this. Maybe I'll start a async conversation on the SIG-AUTH channel, and then if we need to, we can also add this for the next week's agenda, the bi-weekly agenda. But yeah, thank you everyone for the discussion. See you all again in 2 weeks from now. Thank you.
Well,
thank you.